My name is Douglas Fletcher. I'm a radio astronomer, and for the past 20 years, I've spent my life chasing signals from the stars, trying to uncover the secrets of the universe. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I found in the Nevada desert near Area 51. It all started when I picked up a series of strange radio frequencies that didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. They weren't from satellites or natural cosmic sources. They were something different, something impossible. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I brought along my wife, Maggie, even though she hadn't been in the field for years. She used to be a military cryptographer, but after some classified missions left her shaken, she swore off anything remotely dangerous. Still, she agreed to come. Maybe because she missed the thrill, or maybe because she wanted to keep an eye on me. We also had Eli Daniels with us, my graduate student. He's a tech genius, always tinkering with equipment and finding ways to push boundaries. He was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement about this trip. We loaded up our modified RV, a beat-up 1987 Fleetwood Bounder packed with radio gear, and headed deep into the desert. The drive was long and quiet. The Nevada desert stretched out endlessly around us, its emptiness both beautiful and eerie. Maggie sat beside me, staring out at the horizon, while Eli fiddled with wires in the back, muttering about signal interference. By the time we reached our destination, a remote spot near a restricted military zone, the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery reds and oranges. We set up camp quickly. The RV's antenna hummed as Eli powered up the equipment, and within minutes, we started picking up faint signals. They were faint but clear, patterns that didn't make sense for natural sources. Maggie leaned over Eli's shoulder, her brows furrowed as she studied the data. "This isn't set random," she said quietly. "These frequencies, they're structured." I felt a chill run down my spine. Structured signals meant intelligence, something or someone was sending them. As night fell, an unexpected visitor arrived. Ruth Martinez, a native elder who lived nearby. She was small and frail-looking, but had an air of quiet strength about her. She approached our camp slowly, her dark eyes scanning everything as if she could see right through us. "You shouldn't be here," she said bluntly. I exchanged a glance with Maggie before answering. "We're just here to study some radio signals." Ruth shook her head and pointed toward the mountains in the distance. "This land is cursed. Skin stealers walk here." "Skin stealers?" Eli asked nervously. Ruth explained that they were ancient spirits, creatures that could take on the form of humans or animals but were never quite right. Their joints bent backward. Their eyes reflected light like animals. She warned us that military testing had disturbed them, waking them from their slumber. I wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, but there was something about her tone, something about the way Maggie stiffened beside me, that made me hesitate. Before Ruth left, she handed us small talismans made of twisted wood and feathers. "Keep these close," she said firmly. "They might protect you." That night, as we sat inside the RV reviewing data from the equipment, an unsettling feeling settled over me. The signals were growing stronger and stranger. But it wasn't just that. The desert outside felt alive somehow, like it was watching us. I glanced at Maggie as she stared out the window into the darkness. "You okay?" I asked. She didn't look at me when she answered. "Something seeps out there." Her words sent another chill down my spine. And then we heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside the RV. The next morning, I woke up to Maggie shaking my shoulder. Her face was pale, and her voice was sharp. "Douglas, come outside. You need to see this." I climbed out of the RV, still groggy, and froze when I saw what she was talking about. There were dead coyotes, dozens of them, lying in a perfect circle around our RV. Their bodies were twisted unnaturally, their eyes wide open and staring blankly at the sky. Eli stepped out behind me, his face turning white as he took in the scene. What happened to them?" "I don't know," I said quietly. Though my heart was pounding, the desert was silent, except for the faint hum of our equipment inside the RV. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Maggie crouched down beside one of the coyotes, carefully examining its body without touching it. No visible wounds, she murmured. It sits like they just dropped dead. I noticed tracks in the sand nearby, large paw prints that suddenly shifted into something resembling human footprints. They led away from the circle and disappeared into the distance. Those tracks, Eli said nervously, pointing at them. That sip's not normal. Before I could respond, we heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A sheriff's car pulled up near our camp. And Officer Nathan Holbrook stepped out. He was a tall man with a weathered face that looked like it had seen too much. He adjusted his hat and approached us cautiously. "Morning," he said gruffly, eyeing the coyotes with a frown. "You folks okay?" "We said are fine," Maggie replied quickly. "But this isn't set or exactly normal." Holbrook nodded grimly. "No, it's not." He glanced around the area before continuing. 3 hikers went missing out here last week. Their campsite was found abandoned, no signs of struggle, but no sign of them either. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Missing hikers? Dead animals? Strange tracks? It all felt connected somehow. As Holbrook walked around the camp, Eli called me over to the equipment inside the RV. "Douglas," he said urgently, pointing at the monitor. "The signals are changing." I leaned in to look at the screen. The patterns we'd been tracking had shifted. They were faster now, more erratic, but still structured in a way that didn't make sense for natural phenomena. Maggie joined us inside and stared at the monitor for a long moment before speaking softly. "These frequencies, they remind me of something I worked on years ago." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Military codes." Her words hung heavy in the air. Later that afternoon, as we tried to make sense of everything, Eli wandered off to set up some additional equipment nearby. He came back about an hour later looking confused. "Where were you?" Maggie asked sharply. "I was just setting up the antenna," he replied. "For an hour?" she pressed. Eli frowned and shook his head. "No, it was only 10 minutes. We exchanged uneasy glances. Something wasn't right. As evening fell, we spotted a figure watching us from a distance, a tall silhouette standing perfectly still against the fading light. When Eli pointed at it, it moved with impossible speed, disappearing behind a ridge before any of us could react. Ruth returned, just before nightfall with more talismans, and performed a blessing ritual around our RV. She didn't say much this time. She just worked silently with a grim expression on her face. That night, as we reviewed more data from the equipment, Maggie translated part of what sounded like voice transmissions buried within the signals, warnings about the thief of forms. I didn't sleep much after that. That night, the desert seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet. Even the faint rustle of the wind had stopped, leaving only the hum of our equipment inside the RV. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, and it set my nerves on edge. Eli was glued to his laptop, his face lit by the glow of the screen. "Douglas," he said suddenly, his voice low but urgent. "You need to hear this." I leaned over his shoulder as he played back a recording from earlier in the evening. At first, it was just static, but then I heard it. Voices. Faint, garbled voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. "What is that?" I asked. Maggie joined us, her expression serious as she listened. "It's Sep's an ancient dialect," she said after a moment. "I can translate all of it, but it's Sep's a warning. Something about Sep thief of form Seps and Sep's shadows that walk." Eli turned to me, his eyes wide. "You think this is connected to what Ruth was talking about? The skin stealers?" I didn't answer him, because I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that something wasn't right out here. As we sat there trying to make sense of it all, Maggie suddenly stiffened and pointed at one of the monitors. "Look at this." The temperature readings from our sensors outside were dropping rapidly, far too quickly for a desert night. And then we noticed something else. Cold spots moving across the sand, like invisible shapes gliding through the air. "What could cause that?" Eli whispered. Before I could respond, we heard a loud thud against the side of the RV. All 3 of us froze, staring at each other in silence. Another thud came, followed by a scraping sound that made my skin crawl. Maggie grabbed a flashlight and motioned for us to follow her outside. Against my better judgment, I did. The desert was pitch black except for the beam of Maggie's flashlight cutting through the darkness. We circled the RV slowly, but there was nothing there, no footprints, no animals, nothing. And then we saw them. Dozens of animals, coyotes, jackrabbits, even a few deer, were standing just beyond the reach of our light. They were perfectly still, their heads tilted slightly as if they were watching us. But their eyes reflected back at us like mirrors in the dark. Something's wrong with them, Maggie murmured. Eli took a step closer, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Don't, I said firmly. We backed away slowly and returned to the RV, locking every door and window behind us. My heart was pounding in my chest as we sat there in silence, listening for any sign of movement outside. Around midnight, Eli went to lie down in one of the bunks, while Maggie and I stayed up reviewing more data from the equipment. It wasn't until hours later that we realized something was off. "Where's Seps, Eli?" Maggie asked suddenly. "He's asleep," I said without looking up from my laptop. "No," she said firmly. "He sits not." I glanced toward the bunks and felt my stomach drop when I saw they were empty. We searched every inch of the RV, but Eli was nowhere to be found. Just as panic started to set in, we heard a knock at the door, a soft but deliberate knock that made my blood run cold. Maggie grabbed a kitchen knife from one of the drawers before opening the door cautiously. Eli stood there on the other side, looking confused and rubbing his eyes. "Where were you?" Maggie demanded. "I sep in here," he said defensively. "I was asleep in my bunk." "No," she snapped. "You weren't set." Eli frowned and shook his head like he didn't set understand what she was saying. "I don't set know what you stir talking about." Something about him felt off. His voice sounded normal enough, but his movements were stiff and unnatural, like he wasn't entirely comfortable in his own skin. Maggie and I exchanged a worried glance but didn't say anything else that night. We just locked ourselves inside and waited for morning to come. The next morning, the desert felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. Maggie was quiet as she sipped her coffee, her eyes fixed on Eli, who was fiddling with the equipment. I could tell she was watching him closely, and honestly, so was I. Something about him wasn't sitting right. Eli seemed normal enough. He joked about the heat and complained about the signal interference, but there were moments when his movements felt off. He'd pause mid-sentence or stare into space for just a little too long. Maggie didn't say anything outright, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Later that morning, I decided to review the camera footage from the previous night to see if we could figure out what had happened while Eli was missing. As I scrolled through the recordings, my stomach dropped. "Douglas," Maggie said sharply from across the RV. "What is it?" I pointed at the screen. "Look at this." The footage showed Eli walking away from the RV around midnight, something he swore he hadn't done. But here's where it got worse. At the same time, another figure appeared in the frame. It looked exactly like Eli. Same clothes, same posture, but it wasn't him. The second Eli moved differently, its joints bending in ways that weren't natural. Maggie leaned closer, her face pale. "That's not him," she whispered. We both turned to look at Eli, who was sitting at the table with his laptop, completely unaware of what we'd just seen. Maggie Sepp's military instincts kicked in. She grabbed me by the arm and pulled me aside. "Douglas," she said quietly, "something Sepp's wrong with him." "What are you saying?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. "I don't think that Sepp's Eli," she said firmly. Before we could decide what to do, Ruth arrived at our camp again. She walked straight up to Maggie and handed her a small pouch filled with herbs and stones. "You Sepp seen it now," Ruth said simply. Maggie nodded. "We think something's pretending to be him." Ruth didn't seem surprised. She explained that skinwalkers often mimic their victims but aren't perfect at first. They take time to absorb memories and traits. "Watch for changes," she warned us. "They slip up." Sheriff Holbrook showed up shortly after Ruth left, carrying a grim expression and a weathered wallet in his hand. Found this near one of the missing hikers' camps, he said, tossing it onto our table. Maggie opened it carefully and froze when she saw the name inside, Micah Calloway. She turned to me and whispered urgently, "Douglas, some of Eli Sipp's mannerisms match Micah Sipp's description from the Sheriff Sipp's report." I stared at her in disbelief. "You stir saying?" "Yes," she interrupted firmly. "I think whatever this thing is, it Sipp's not just mimicking Eli, it Sipp's mimicking Micah too." I checked Eli's laptop while he wasn't looking and found something else that made my blood run cold. Research papers on skinwalker legends that none of us had downloaded. They were detailed accounts of how these creatures operated, how they absorbed memories and traits from their victims. When I confronted Eli about it later that afternoon, he looked genuinely confused. "I didn't download those," he insisted. But Maggie wasn't buying it anymore. She grabbed his phone and found text messages sent to numbers we didn't recognize, messages Eli swore he hadn't sent. Ruth returned one last time before sunset and confirmed what Maggie had suspected. Skinwalkers are incomplete when they first mimic someone. They learn by observing their victims, by spending time with them. "Whatever you do," Ruth warned us as she handed over more talismans, "don't trust anything you see or hear tonight." As darkness fell over the desert again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by whatever was pretending to be Eli, but by something bigger, something worse. The desert night wrapped around us like a heavy blanket, and the RV felt smaller than ever. Maggie sat at the table, sharpening a knife she'd pulled from the kitchen drawer. Her eyes kept darting toward Eli, who was sitting quietly in the corner, staring at his laptop. He hadn't said much since our confrontation earlier, and his silence was unnerving. I tried to focus on the equipment, but my hands were shaking. The signals we'd been tracking were getting louder, almost like they were closing in on us. Every so often, I'd glance at the monitors, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at me. "Douglas," Maggie whispered suddenly, breaking the silence. "Look." She pointed toward Eli. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. He was just sitting there, his back to us. But then I noticed it. His shoulders were moving oddly, like he was breathing too fast or not breathing at all. "Eli." I called out cautiously. He didn't respond. Maggie stood up slowly, gripping the knife tightly in her hand. "Eli," she said firmly, "turn around." For a moment, he didn't move. Then with a stiff and unnatural motion, he swiveled in his chair to face us. His eyes were wrong, too wide, too bright, and his smile didn't reach them. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but hollow. Maggie didn't answer. She stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. "Who are you?" she demanded. Eli tilted his head slightly, like he didn't understand the question. "It sets me," he said, with that same unsettling smile. "A lie." "No," Maggie said sharply. "You said you're not." Before I could react, Maggie lunged forward and pressed the blade of the knife against his arm, not hard enough to hurt him, but enough to test his reaction. Eli flinched, but didn't cry out. Instead, he laughed, a low, chilling sound that made my stomach turn. "You're smarter than I thought," he said quietly. And then it happened. Right before our eyes, Eli's body began to change. His skin rippled like water, and his joints bent at impossible angles. His face twisted into something unrecognizable, half human, half animal, with glowing eyes that reflected the dim light inside the RV. Maggie stumbled back in shock as the creature let out a guttural growl, its voice layered with echoes of Eli's and someone else's, maybe Micah's. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The creature tilted its head again and grinned, a wide, unnatural grin that showed too many teeth. "To learn," it said simply. "To become?" Ruth's warnings echoed in my mind. They learn by observing their victims. Maggie grabbed one of Ruth's talismans from the table and held it up toward the creature. It hissed and recoiled slightly, but didn't retreat completely. "We need to trap it," Maggie said urgently. "How?" I asked desperately. "Ruth test rituals," she replied. "She told me how to bind them." With shaking hands, Maggie began arranging the talismans in a circle around the creature while I distracted it by asking questions, anything to keep its attention on me. "Why are you here?" I asked. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto mine. "You brought us here," it said simply. "What do you mean?" I pressed. "The signals," it replied. "Your machines called us." My heart sank as realization hit me. Our equipment, the very thing we'd brought to study these strange frequencies, had somehow attracted them to us. Before I could ask anything else, Maggie finished setting up the circle and began chanting softly under her breath. The creature thrashed and snarled as an invisible force seemed to hold it in place. But then it stopped struggling and smiled again. A cold, knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. "You think you stir safe," it said mockingly, "but more are coming." And with that, it let out an ear-piercing screech that shattered one of the RV's windows before dissolving into a cloud of black smoke and escaping into the night. We were left standing there in stunned silence as the desert wind howled through the broken window. "They fear learning from us," Maggie whispered finally. "Every second we set her out here. They fear getting stronger." I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that she was right or the fact that we had no idea how to stop them. The next morning, the desert felt different. Heavier, darker, like the sunlight wasn't strong enough to push back the shadows. Maggie and I barely spoke as we packed up the RV. Ellie, or whatever had been pretending to be Ellie, was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Ruth arrived just before we left, her face lined with worry. "You need to go to the site," she said firmly. "The answers are there." "What site?" Maggie asked. Ruth handed us a map, her fingers trembling slightly. "The burial grounds," she said, "where it all began." I hesitated. "Ruth, what are we dealing with here?" She looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fear and sadness. "Ancient warriors," she said quietly. "Bound by rituals long ago, they were meant to protect this land, but something went wrong. They became monsters." Maggie frowned. "And the military, what do they have to do with this?" Ruth's lips tightened into a thin line. "They disturbed the burial grounds years ago. They thought they could control them, use their power for their own purposes." I glanced at Maggie, who was already unfolding the map and studying it. "We'll go," she said firmly. Sheriff Holbrook showed up as we were leaving, his patrol car kicking up dust as it pulled alongside the RV. He stepped out and adjusted his hat, his expression grim. "You folks heading somewhere?" he asked. Maggie didn't hesitate. "To the burial grounds." Holbrook's face darkened. "You don't want to go there." "Why not?" I asked. He sighed heavily and looked around like he was making sure no one else was listening. "Because that's where it started," he said quietly. "The disappearance, the experiments, everything." "What experiments?" Maggie pressed. Holbrook hesitated before answering. "Project Skinweave," he said finally. "The government's attempt to harness shape-shifting abilities for warfare." My stomach turned as his words sank in. "They thought they could control it," Holbrook continued, his voice bitter, "but they couldn't sit." We didn't have time to ask more questions. Maggie was already climbing into the RV and motioning for me to follow. The drive to the burial grounds was tense and silent. The map led us deep into the desert, far away from any roads or signs of civilization. By the time we reached the site, the sun was high in the sky, but it did little to ease my nerves. The burial grounds were hidden within a cave system carved into the side of a rocky hill. The entrance was marked by ancient petroglyphs, symbols that looked like warriors and animals intertwined in battle. "This is it," Maggie said quietly as she stepped out of the RV. We entered the cave cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of our footsteps, the drip of water from unseen cracks in the stone. Deeper inside, we found remnants of rituals, twisted wooden figures, animal bones arranged in intricate patterns, and symbols painted on the walls in faded red dye. Maggie stopped suddenly and pointed at one of the symbols. "I've seen this before," she said. "Where?" I asked. "In classified military documents," she replied grimly. We kept moving until we reached a chamber filled with modern equipment, computers, monitoring devices, even military crates stamped with government logos. "They've been here recently," Maggie muttered. I ran my hand over one of the crates and felt a chill when I saw what was inside. Vials of blood samples labeled with names I didn't recognize. "This isn't SEP just research," Maggie said darkly. "It's SEP's experimentation." Before I could respond, we heard a sound behind us, a low growl that echoed through the chamber. We turned slowly and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their joints bending backward and their glowing eyes fixed on us. "They set her awake," Maggie whispered, "and then they started moving toward us." We ran. The moment those figures started moving toward us, Maggie grabbed my arm and we bolted out of the cave. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The creatures didn't chase us immediately. They just stood there, watching, like they were deciding whether we were worth the effort. By the time we reached the RV, Sheriff Holbrook was already waiting for us. He stepped out of his patrol car, his face pale and drawn. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tense. "They set her awake," Maggie said breathlessly. "The skinwalkers, they set her in the cave." Holbrook's jaw tightened. "Then it's SIP's worse than I thought." "What do you mean?" I demanded. He looked at both of us, his expression grim. "The government SIP's been tracking them for years," he admitted. "They knew this would happen eventually." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "You stir saying they knew these things would wake up?" Holbrook nodded slowly. "They didn't set just wake up. They were awakened. The experiments at the burial grounds, they were deliberate." I felt my stomach drop. Why? Why would they do that? "To weaponize them," Holbrook said simply. "Shapeshifters that can mimic anyone, infiltrate anywhere, it stops the perfect soldier." Maggie shook her head in disbelief. "And now they SIP lost control." Holbrook didn't answer, but the look on his face said enough. As we stood there trying to process everything, the RV's radio crackled to life with a burst of static. At first, it was just noise, but then a voice came through, low and distorted, speaking in that same ancient dialect we'd heard before. Maggie rushed inside and began decoding the transmission while Holbrook and I kept watch outside. The desert was eerily quiet again, and every shadow seemed alive. After what felt like an eternity, Maggie called out from inside the RV, "Douglas, you need to see this." I climbed into the RV and stared at the screen as Maggie pointed to a series of coordinates embedded in the signal. "They SUP are leading us somewhere," she said. "To what?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it SIP's connected to the burial grounds and to whatever the government was doing here." Holbrook joined us inside and studied the coordinates with a frown. "That's near one of our old testing sites," he said quietly. "Testing for what?" Maggie demanded. He hesitated before answering. "Containment protocols." Maggie SEP's eyes widened as realization hit her. They weren't SEP just experimenting on skinwalkers. They were trying to trap them. Holbrook nodded grimly, and it didn't STEP work. I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at Maggie. If they couldn't SEP contain them, what chance do we have? She didn't answer right away, but her expression hardened with determination. "We follow the coordinates," she said finally. "We find out what they were trying to hide." As night fell over the desert again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led into a trap, not by the government but by something far older and far more dangerous. The coordinates led us deeper into the desert, far beyond the burial grounds and any trace of civilization. The RV rumbled over uneven terrain, kicking up dust as the sun rose higher in the sky. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, her jaw clenched and her eyes scanning the horizon. Sheriff Holbrook followed behind us in his patrol car, his radio crackling with occasional bursts of static. The silence between us was heavy, but I could feel the tension building with every mile. Something was waiting for us out here. I could feel it in my bones. When we finally reached the location marked by the coordinates, I stopped the RV and stepped outside. The area looked unremarkable at first, just a flat stretch of desert surrounded by jagged rocks. But as we walked closer, we saw them dozens of figures standing perfectly still in the distance. Maggie froze beside me, her hand tightening around the knife she'd strapped to her belt. "They're watching us," she whispered. Holbrook joined us, his face pale as he stared at the figures. "They stir not just watching," he said quietly. "They stir waiting." I swallowed hard and turned to Maggie. "What do we do?" She didn't answer right away, but her gaze shifted to Ruth Sepp's talismans hanging from her belt. "We use the ritual," she said firmly. "It's Sepp's the only way." Holbrook frowned. "You start talking about blood magic." Maggie nodded grimly. "It's Sepp's what Ruth said would reveal their true forms and weaken them." I hesitated, my stomach twisting at the thought. Blood magic sounded like something out of a horror movie, but at this point, it felt like our only option. As Maggie began setting up the ritual circle with Ruth's talismans and herbs, I noticed movement among the figures in the distance. They were starting to shift, slowly at first, but then faster, their forms twisting and bending unnaturally. "They seemed cunning," Holbrook said sharply. Maggie worked faster, her hands steady despite the growing tension around us. She muttered something under her breath, a chant Ruth had taught her, and then sliced her palm with the knife, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the center of the circle. The air around us changed instantly. It felt heavier, colder, like something was pressing down on us from all sides. The figures in the distance began to shimmer and distort, their human-like appearances melting away to reveal their true forms. Grotesque creatures with elongated limbs, glowing eyes, and skin that seemed to ripple like water. "They're not human," I whispered, my voice trembling. Maggie stepped back from the circle as the creatures let out guttural growls and began moving toward us. Faster now, their movements jerky but deliberate. "Get inside," Holbrook shouted. We scrambled back into the RV as the creatures closed in around us. Maggie grabbed one of Ruth's talismans and held it up toward them through the broken window. The creatures hissed and recoiled slightly but didn't stop advancing. "We can stay here," I said urgently. Maggie shook her head. "If we leave now, they still follow us?" "What's Sepp's your plan?" Holbrook demanded. She turned to me with a determined look in her eyes. "Douglas, can you amplify Ruth Sepp's chant using the radio equipment?" I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I think so." While Maggie worked to keep the creatures at bay with Ruth's talismans, I scrambled to modify our radio setup. My hands were shaking as I adjusted frequencies and connected wires, but somehow I managed to get it working. "Ready?" I said breathlessly. Maggie handed me a piece of paper with Ruth's chant written on it. "Broadcast this," she said firmly. I read the words into the microphone, my voice trembling as I spoke. The chant echoed through the RV speakers and out into the desert, carried by amplified radio waves. The effect was immediate. The creatures froze mid-step, their bodies convulsing as if they were being torn apart from within. Their glowing eyes flickered like dying embers, and their guttural growls turned into high-pitched screeches that made my ears ring. But then something happened that none of us expected. Instead of retreating or disappearing entirely, the creatures began merging together, forming a massive entity that towered over us like a living nightmare. "What is that?" Holbrook shouted. "It Sepp's all of them," Maggie said grimly. "Combined." The massive entity let out an earth-shaking roar and lunged toward us just as Holbrook reached for his emergency beacon, a small device designed to call for backup in extreme situations. He pressed it without hesitation, triggering a bright flare that shot into the sky. Minutes later, military helicopters appeared on the horizon, their rotors slicing through the air as they descended toward our location. Armed soldiers poured out onto the desert floor and opened fire on the entity with everything they had: guns, explosives, even flamethrowers. The battle was chaos, deafening noise mixed with blinding light, but somehow Maggie managed to pull me away from it all and back into the RV. "We need to go," she said urgently. "What about Eli?" I asked weakly. She shook her head. "He sits gone." With tears in my eyes and fear gripping my heart, I started up the RV and drove away from the site as fast as I could. Behind us, explosions lit up the night sky like fireworks, a horrifying reminder of what we'd left behind. We drove for hours, the RV rattling over uneven terrain as the desert stretched endlessly around us. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the armrests tightly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Sheriff Holbrook followed behind us in his patrol car, but neither of us said a word. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from the RV's radio. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen, the creatures, the merging, the chaos. My mind was racing with questions. Were they still alive? Had the military contained them? Or had we just unleashed something far worse? As night fell, Maggie finally spoke. "Douglas," she said quietly, "we set not safe." I glanced at her, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. She turned to look at me, her expression grim. "They stir still out there, and they know us now." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down I knew she was right. The skinwalkers, or whatever they were, had learned from us. They'd mimicked us, studied us, and now they were something more. Suddenly, Holbrook's voice crackled through the radio. "Pull over," he said urgently. I stopped the RV and stepped outside, my heart pounding as Holbrook climbed out of his patrol car and approached us. He looked pale and shaken, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "What is it?" Maggie asked sharply. Holbrook hesitated before answering. "I think one of them followed us." My stomach dropped as I scanned the desert around us. It was pitch black except for the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the sand. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed movement in the distance. A figure was walking toward us slowly, its silhouette distorted and unnatural, its joints bent backward with every step, and its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness like twin headlights. "Get inside," Holbrook said firmly. We scrambled back into the RV and locked every door and window behind us. Maggie grabbed one of Ruth's talismans and held it tightly in her hand while Holbrook stood by the door with his gun drawn. The figure stopped just outside the RV, its glowing eyes staring directly at us through the window. It didn't move or make a sound. It just stood there like it was waiting for something. "What does it want?" I whispered. Maggie shook her head. "It sets testing us." Holbrook frowned. "Testing us for what?" "To see if we're worth keeping," she replied grimly. Her words sent a fresh wave of fear through me as I watched the figure outside. It wasn't just a monster, it was intelligent. It knew exactly what it was doing. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again, not with Holbrook's voice, but with something else entirely. A low, distorted voice echoed through the speakers, speaking in that same ancient dialect we'd heard before. Maggie grabbed a notebook and began scribbling furiously as she tried to translate the words. "It's saying, 'You cannot run,'" she muttered. "Run from what?" I asked desperately. She looked up at me with wide eyes. "From them." Before I could respond, the figure outside began to change, its body twisting and contorting until it resembled someone familiar. Eli. My heart sank as I stared at its face, the same face I'd seen every day for years, but I knew it wasn't him. It was just another mimic. "It's trying to trick us," Maggie said firmly. Holbrook raised his gun and aimed it at the window. I set not falling for it. Before he could pull the trigger, Maggie grabbed his arm and stopped him. "No," she said urgently. "If you attack it now, you so provoke them." "Then what do we do?" he demanded. Maggie took a deep breath and turned to me. "Douglas, amplify Ruth Sepp's chant again." I hesitated for a moment before nodding and rushing to set up the equipment once more. My hands were shaking as I adjusted frequencies and connected wires, but somehow I managed to get it working. As Maggie began chanting softly under her breath, Holbrook kept watch by the window while clutching his gun tightly. The figure outside didn't move. It just stared at us with those glowing eyes that seemed to see right through me. When Maggie finished her chant, I broadcasted it through the RV's speakers once more. The sound echoed across the desert like a ripple in water, and this time it worked faster than before. The figure outside convulsed violently before dissolving into black smoke that disappeared into thin air, but not before letting out an ear-piercing screech that made my ears ring painfully loud. For a moment after that, everything went silent again. But this time, it felt different somehow, as if something bigger was lurking nearby and waiting patiently for its next move. The desert was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel small, like the world had stopped breathing. Maggie sat beside me in the RV, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched Ruth's talisman. Sheriff Holbrook was outside, pacing back and forth, his gun still drawn. I stared at the radio equipment, wondering if I'd made things worse. The chant had worked, it had driven the skinwalker away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of something far bigger, something we couldn't possibly understand. "We need to leave," Maggie said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. I nodded, but my body felt heavy, like it didn't want to move. "Where do we go?" I asked weakly. She turned to me with a grim expression. "Anywhere but here." Holbrook climbed back into his patrol car and motioned for us to follow him. "I'll escort you out of the area," he said firmly. "The military will handle the rest." I didn't ask what he meant by handle. I didn't want to know. We drove for hours, the RV rattling over uneven terrain as the desert stretched endlessly around us. Maggie didn't say much. She just stared out the window, her eyes distant. Holbrook's car stayed close behind us, his headlights cutting through the darkness. As we neared civilization, Holbrook's voice crackled through the radio one last time. "This is where I leave you," he said. I pulled over and stepped out of the RV to thank him, but when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His pupils were glowing faintly in the moonlight, and his movements felt just a little too stiff. "Good luck," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I watched as he drove away into the night, my heart pounding in my chest. Maggie joined me outside and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Douglas," she said softly, "he sits not Holbrook anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The skinwalkers hadn't just followed us, they'd infiltrated us. We climbed back into the RV and drove in silence until we reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. Maggie insisted we stay there for the night while she contacted her old military connections to figure out what to do next. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside made my heart race. The next morning, Maggie received a call from one of her contacts, a former colleague who confirmed everything Ruth and Holbrook had told us. The government had been experimenting with skinwalkers for years, trying to weaponize their abilities, but they'd underestimated them, underestimated their intelligence and their hunger for power. "They stir not just creatures," Maggie said after hanging up. "They stir predators." We were placed in witness protection shortly after that. New names, new identities, a new town far away from Nevada. The government wanted to keep us quiet about what we'd seen, what we'd learned. For a while, things seemed normal again, or as normal as they could be after everything we'd been through. Maggie and I tried to rebuild our lives, but there was always an unspoken fear between us, a fear that they weren't done with us yet. One evening, as I was sitting on our porch watching the sunset, I noticed something strange about our neighbor across the street. He was standing perfectly still in his yard, staring directly at me with unblinking eyes. And then he smiled. A wide, unnatural smile, and raised his hand in a wave. I froze as I noticed his joints bending backward when he moved. My name is Thomas Ridgway. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I've spent years chasing rare animals across the globe. But this trip was supposed to be different. It wasn't just about the photos. It was about getting away, clearing my head after my divorce, and proving to myself that I still had what it takes to do something extraordinary. I was heading to the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, a place where legends whispered through the trees and shadows danced under the moonlight. My research assistant, Elaine Holt, was with me. She's smart, sharp, and Well, she's also my secret lover. Complicated, I know. But out here, away from everything else, it felt simpler. We arrived in my custom-outfitted 1974 Winnebago, a mobile darkroom on wheels, and met up with Ray Pearson, my old friend and guide. Ray's lived in these mountains his whole life. He knows every trail, every rock, every howl in the night. His wife Kate joined us too. She's quiet, but has this eerie knowledge of local folklore that makes you wonder how much she believes in it all. The plan was simple: document the elusive red wolves rumored to roam these parts. But as we stocked up on supplies at a local diner, the atmosphere shifted. The diner owner, Mabel Collins, warned us about Howler's Ridge. Her voice trembled as she said it wasn't safe. Something about creatures that weren't just wolves, but something more, something worse. Kate handed me a silver knife as we loaded up the RV. Just in case, she said, with a knowing look that made my stomach twist. Ray seemed unusually quiet too, muttering about bad omens and rituals for protection. I laughed it off. I mean, come on. We're scientists. Folklore is just stories passed down to scare kids, right? Still, there was an unease hanging over us like a storm cloud as we drove deeper into the mountains. The air grew colder, the trees thicker, and the shadows longer. By the time we reached our campsite near some ancient stone formations, even I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The campsite was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant rustle of branches, the faint whistle of the wind. Ray and Kate seemed uneasy from the moment we arrived. Ray poured whiskey into a small tin cup and sprinkled tobacco around the edges of the camp. He muttered something under his breath, and when I asked what he was doing, he just said, "For protection." I didn't press him. Ray had always been superstitious, but I figured it was just his way of keeping us safe. Elaine and I focused on setting up the trail cameras around the area. We found paw prints in the dirt. Huge ones, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong too, like something caught between a dog's paw and a human hand. That first night, the howls started. They weren't like normal wolf howls. They were deeper, longer, and seemed to echo in ways that didn't make sense. Elaine joked that maybe it was just an old bear with a sore throat, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. When we went to bed in the RV, things got worse. I had this dream. No, not a dream. A nightmare so vivid it felt real. I was running through the woods, branches clawing at my skin, something chasing me but always staying just out of sight. I could hear its breathing, low and guttural, and feel its eyes burning into my back. When I woke up, my heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. Elaine looked pale too. Did you dream about being hunted?" she asked quietly. I nodded, and her face went even whiter. Ray admitted he'd had nightmares too, though he wouldn't say what they were about. Kate didn't sleep at all. She spent the night staring out the window with that silver knife clutched in her hand. The next morning brought more strange discoveries. The trail cameras we'd set up were destroyed, shattered and clawed apart like they'd been attacked by something big and mean. Claw marks ran up tree trunks 7 feet high, far taller than any wolf could reach on its own. Scout, Ray's dog, refused to leave the RV. He whimpered and growled at nothing we could see. Ray said it was time to leave, that this place wasn't safe, but I refused to go. It's probably just a bear. I told him firmly, we are here to document wildlife, not run away from it. But deep down, something about this place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here at all. The 4th day started out calm, but there was this heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my camera and decided to explore the edge of the woods near our camp. Elaine stayed behind to go through some old records she'd brought along. She'd found something about disappearances in the area, cases that happened every 41 years, like clockwork. As I walked through the trees, I noticed something strange. The shadows seemed off. They moved in ways they shouldn't, like they were alive, stretching and twisting, even though the sun was steady in the sky. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it, a shape at the edge of my vision. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and it moved fast, disappearing behind a tree before I could get a good look. I raised my camera and snapped a few shots, hoping to catch whatever it was. My hands were shaking as I looked through the lens, but when I lowered it, there was nothing there, just trees and silence. Back at camp, Elaine had made a discovery. "Thomas," she said, her voice low and serious, "look at this." She showed me an old newspaper clipping from 1935 about a man who claimed to have killed a creature near Howler's Ridge, a creature that wasn't fully human or fully animal. The article described it as a dogman, a local legend about guardians of the forest corrupted by violence. Ray overheard us and went pale. "That man, he was my grandfather," he admitted reluctantly. "He always said killing that thing cursed our family." Before we could press him for more details, Scout bolted out of the RV, barking wildly. We chased after him into the woods, yelling his name, but he disappeared into the trees. Hours later, he came back, bloody and shaking. His fur was matted with something dark and sticky, and his eyes were wide with fear. He wouldn't let anyone near him except Ray. That night was worse than anything we'd experienced so far. As we sat around the fire trying to make sense of everything, I noticed glowing eyes in the darkness beyond the flames, amber eyes that reflected red when they caught the light just right. They were watching us, unblinking and unnervingly still. I grabbed my camera and took a picture, but when I looked at the photo later, those eyes weren't where they should have been. They were closer, too close, like whatever it was had moved without making a sound. Ray finally broke down and told us everything. "My grandfather swore he killed one of those things," he said quietly, staring into the fire, "but he always said there were more of them, and they never forget." We all slept, or tried to, in shifts that night. The howls came again, louder this time, circling our camp like they were testing us. I started to wonder if maybe we weren't hunting something out here after all. Maybe it was hunting us. By the 5th day, the tension was unbearable. The forest seemed alive, watching us, waiting for something. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Ray wanted to leave. He was adamant about it now, but I couldn't. I told him we were too close to finding something incredible, something no one else had ever documented. But deep down, I wasn't set so sure anymore. That morning, we found the RV's tires slashed, not cut with a knife. No, these were claw marks long and deep, like something with sharp talons had ripped through the rubber. There were no tracks around the RV, no sign of anything or anyone, just the damage and the silence that followed it. "Thomas," Ray said, his voice trembling slightly, "this isn't set normal. We set not dealing with animals here." The radio started acting up too. Between bursts of static, we heard voices, faint but clear enough to make out our names being whispered. At first I thought it was interference or some kind of prank, but then Elaine froze and turned to me. Her face pale as a sheet. "That's my ex-husband's voice," she whispered. I didn't know what to say. It didn't make sense. None of this did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just watching us anymore, it was playing with us. Later that afternoon, I developed some of the photos I'd taken over the past few days. My hands shook as I watched the images come to life in the darkroom set up inside the RV. In one photo, taken from outside the RV at night, there were figures standing in the shadows near our windows, tall, bipedal figures with glowing eyes staring straight at us while we slept inside. I showed the photo to Ray and Kate. Kate crossed herself and muttered something under her breath in a language I didn't recognize. Ray just stared at it for a long time before finally speaking. "They sep been here since day one," he said quietly. "They sep been watching us this whole time." That night was when everything spiraled out of control. Scout was missing again. We found him hours later, hanging from a tree just beyond the campsite. He'd been torn apart in a way that made my stomach churn and my knees go weak. It wasn't just an attack, it was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Ray pulled out a box of silver bullets he'd brought with him just in case. He handed me one of his rifles and told me to keep it close. "This isn't set about science anymore," he said firmly. "This is about survival." As darkness fell, we heard them again, the howls. But this time they were closer than ever before, and then we saw them. A pack of wolves stepped into the clearing around our camp, their fur shimmering under the moonlight. But as we watched in stunned silence, they began to change. Their bodies stretched unnaturally, their limbs elongating as they rose onto two legs, their faces twisted into something that was both wolf and human, their glowing amber eyes fixed on us like predators sizing up their prey. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move, as one of them let out a low growl that sounded almost like words. "We need to go," Ray whispered urgently. "Now." But deep down, I knew there was no running from this. The generator died just after sunset. One moment, the RV was filled with the comforting hum of power, and the next, we were plunged into darkness. The only light came from the flickering flames of our campfire outside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Ray and Kate stood guard near the fire, while Elaine and I barricaded ourselves inside the RV. I was clutching Ray's rifle so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Every sound outside, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt like it was coming closer. Kate started chanting softly, her voice steady but strained. She was sprinkling mountain ash around the campsite, holding her silver knife in one hand. "This will keep them out," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. Then we heard it, a voice calling out from the woods. "Kate." It was low and gravelly, but familiar enough to make her freeze. She turned toward the sound, her eyes wide. "That's Sip's my father," she whispered. He passed away years ago." Ray grabbed her arm, his voice sharp and urgent. "Dawn Stett, listen to it." That's not him." But Kate didn't seem to hear him. She dropped her knife and stepped toward the trees, her movements slow and dreamlike, like she was in a trance. Ray shouted after her, but she kept walking until she disappeared into the darkness. We found her necklace, the silver one she always wore, broken on the ground near a trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. Ray's face crumpled as he stared at it. "They've got her," he said quietly, his voice shaking. I wanted to believe we could save her, but something told me we'd already lost her. Ray didn't waste any time. "We're going after her," he said, loading his rifle with silver bullets. His hands were steady, but his face was pale. His jaw clenched so tightly, I thought it might snap. Elaine wanted to stay behind and try the radio again. She said she'd call for help, but we both knew no one was coming. Whatever was happening out here wasn't something the authorities would understand or believe. Ray and I followed the blood trail into the woods. The trees seemed taller and closer together now, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for us. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. "Keep your eyes open," Ray muttered. "They still try to separate us." I nodded, gripping my camera tightly in one hand and the rifle in the other. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight, always there, but never close enough to see clearly. Then I saw her. Kate was walking through the trees ahead of us, her back turned, her movements slow and deliberate. "Kate," Ray shouted, but she didn't respond. I started to run toward her, but Ray grabbed my arm and yanked me back. "It's not her," he hissed. I looked at him like he was crazy. Of course it was her. But then I noticed something off. Her movements weren't natural. They were jerky, almost mechanical, and when she turned to face us, her eyes weren't Kate's. They were glowing amber. Before I could react, she began to change. Her body twisted and stretched, her limbs elongating as fur sprouted from her skin. Her face contorted into a snarling wolf-like mask, and a guttural growl escaped her throat. Ray fired his rifle without hesitation, but she or it disappeared into the shadows before the bullet hit. "They Sips are messing with us," Ray said through gritted teeth. "They want us scared." He was right. Every step we took felt like a trap waiting to spring. We kept moving until we stumbled upon an ancient stone altar deep in the woods. It was covered in fresh blood, and strange symbols were carved into its surface, symbols that looked older than anything I'd ever seen. Ray knelt beside it, his face grim. "This is where they do it," he said softly. "This is where they take people." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could speak, I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure darting between the trees. "Kate?" I whispered instinctively. Ray shook his head firmly. "No. Don't follow it." but something inside me couldn't resist. I stepped forward, my heart pounding as I chased after what looked like Kate's silhouette disappearing into the foggy woods. What I found wasn't set Kate, it wasn't set even human. I ran back to the RV as fast as I could, my chest burning with every breath. Whatever I'd seen in the woods, it wasn't Kate, it wasn't human, it was something else entirely, and it was getting closer. When I reached the campsite, the RV was surrounded. They were standing there in a perfect circle, upright like men but covered in fur, their glowing amber eyes fixed on the RV. There must have been at least 6 of them, maybe more. Elaine was inside, her face pressed against the window, her eyes wide with terror. I could see her mouth moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying over the pounding of my own heartbeat. I raised my camera instinctively and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the clearing for a split second, and the creatures flinched, their heads jerking back as if the light hurt them. I used that moment to push through the circle and get inside the RV. "Elaine," I shouted as I slammed the door behind me. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. She was staring at something in front of her, something I couldn't see yet. When I turned to look, my stomach dropped. There was one of them inside the RV with us. It wasn't snarling or growling like the others, it was just standing there, watching Elaine with an expression that almost looked human. "Ray?" Elaine whispered, her voice trembling. I froze. It didn't make sense. Ray wasn't here, he was still out in the woods, but Elaine seemed convinced it was him. She stepped toward it slowly, tears streaming down her face. "It's not him," I yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. The creature turned its head toward me then, its amber eyes narrowing as it let out a low growl that sent chills down my spine. Before it could move, the real Ray burst through the door holding his rifle. He fired without hesitation, and the silver bullet hit its mark. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream as its body convulsed and twisted back into its true form, a grotesque mix of wolf and human that collapsed onto the floor in a heap. But killing one only made the others angry. Outside, they began clawing at the RV, their growls growing louder and more aggressive with every passing second. The walls shook as they slammed their bodies against them, trying to break through. "We can stay here," Ray said urgently. "They tear this place apart." I grabbed my camera equipment and started rigging up improvised light traps using flash bulbs and batteries. "They don't set like bright light," I said quickly. "It might buy us some time." Ray nodded and helped me set them up while Elaine stayed near the back of the RV, clutching a knife with trembling hands. When we activated the traps, they worked at least for a little while. The flashes disoriented the creatures, making them back off temporarily, but it wasn't set enough to stop them. One of them smashed through a window and grabbed Ray before he could react. He screamed as it dragged him outside into the darkness. I tried to go after him, but Elaine held me back. "You'll die too," she cried. Through the broken window, I saw them tear Ray apart, his screams echoing through the night until they stopped suddenly, horribly. Ray was gone. I couldn't process it, not fully. His screams still echoed in my ears, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw them dragging him into the shadows. But there wasn't time to grieve. The creatures were still out there, circling the RV like predators waiting for their prey to make a mistake. Elaine was shaking uncontrollably, clutching the knife like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "We're not going to make it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I refused to believe that. "We'll get out of this," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. The flashes from our improvised traps were running low. They weren't enough to keep the creatures at bay anymore. They were getting bolder, clawing at the walls and windows, snarling and growling like they knew we were trapped. I grabbed my camera and started snapping photos through the broken window, using the flash to disorient them. It worked for a moment. They flinched and backed off, but it wasn't long before they started coming closer again. "We have to make a run for Ray Sipp's truck," I said urgently. "Its steps our only chance." Elaine nodded, though she looked terrified. "What if they catch us?" she asked. I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that staying here meant certain death. We waited for a brief lull in their attacks before making our move. I threw open the RV door and fired the rifle into the air to distract them while Elaine ran toward the truck. I followed close behind, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But they were faster than us. One of them lunged at Elaine, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her to the ground. She screamed as she fought against it, but its strength was overwhelming. I turned back to help her, but what I saw stopped me cold. Her body started to change, her skin rippling as fur began to sprout from her arms and face. Her eyes glowed amber as she let out a guttural growl that sounded more animal than human. "Elaine," I shouted, but she didn't respond. She looked at me for a brief moment, just long enough for me to see something human still flickering behind those glowing eyes, before she turned and disappeared into the woods with the others. I stood there frozen, unable to move or think or breathe. Then I heard them coming back. I forced myself to run toward the truck, throwing myself inside just as one of them lunged for me. The door slammed shut behind me, and I fumbled with the keys until the engine roared to life. As I sped away down the narrow dirt road, tears blurred my vision. I'd lost everyone. Ray, Kate, Elaine, and now I was alone with nothing but my camera and the memories of what had happened. But even as I drove away from Howler's Ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I don't know how I made it out of those mountains alive. The truck's tires skidded on the dirt road as I drove faster than I ever had in my life, the trees blurring into a dark tunnel around me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, and even then I couldn't bring myself to get out. I just sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, staring at nothing. When I finally spoke to the authorities, they didn't believe me. They said it was a bear attack, that Ray and Kate were probably killed by wild animals, and that Elaine must have gotten lost in the woods. They didn't find any bodies, just the wrecked RV and a lot of blood. I didn't argue with them. What was the point? Even if I told them everything, they'd never understand. I went back home to try to put it all behind me, but the memories wouldn't leave. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, Ray being dragged into the darkness, Kate disappearing into the woods, Elaine changing into whatever she became, and those eyes, those glowing amber eyes haunted me every night. I developed the last roll of film for my camera a few weeks later. At first, everything looked normal. Trees, shadows, some blurry shots of the creatures in the distance. But then I noticed something strange. In one of the photos, taken on our very first day at camp, there were figures in the background, tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes watching us from between the trees. They sept been there all along. Months passed, but I couldn't let it go. I told myself it was over, that I was safe now, but deep down I knew better. The forest had taken something from me, and maybe left something behind. One night, as I was sitting alone in my apartment, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, just a split second, I thought I saw my eyes glow amber in the dim light of the moon. I haven't been able to sleep since. A few days ago, I packed up my camera gear and started driving back toward Howler's Ridge. Don't ask me why. I don't have an answer. It's like something is pulling me back there, something I can't fight anymore. The last entry in my journal is different from all the others. The handwriting is shaky and uneven, almost like it wasn't written by me at all. The pages are filled with sketches of wolves, dozens of them, each one more detailed than the last. And on the final page is a single sentence, scrawled over and over again. The forest never forgets. I don't know what's going to happen when I get there, but part of me already knows how this ends. Maybe it was always meant to be this way. My name is Harold Matthews. I'm 42 years old, and I used to be a forest ranger. That was before I lost my job, before the drinking got bad, and before my life started falling apart. Now, I'm just a man trying to hold on to the pieces of my family. My wife, Vivian, thought this trip would help us heal, help me heal. She said being out in nature might remind me of who I used to be. So here we are, driving into the Shoshone National Forest in my Uncle Roy's old Winnebago camper. The drive was long and quiet. Vivian sat next to me, staring out the window, while Bobby, our 16-year-old son, sulked in the back seat with his headphones on. He didn't want to come. Honestly, I didn't either. But Vivian insisted, and when she insists on something, it's hard to say no. We arrived at a secluded campsite deep in the forest. There were no other people around, just tall pine trees stretching toward the sky and the sound of birds chirping somewhere in the distance. The air smelled fresh, clean, like it hadn't been touched by the outside world. Vivian seemed happy as she unpacked our things and set up camp. Bobby wandered off with his Polaroid camera, snapping pictures of trees and rocks like he was trying to kill time. I tried to help Vivian with the setup, but she stopped me when she saw the flask hidden in my jacket pocket. "No alcohol," she said firmly, her voice sharp like a knife. "Not on this trip." I didn't argue. I just nodded and put the flask away, though it felt like a piece of me had been taken. As the sun started to set, Bobby came back with his camera and showed us some photos he'd taken. One of them caught my attention, a picture of claw marks scratched deep into a tree trunk. "What do you think made these?" he asked me. I shrugged and said it was probably a bear or maybe an elk rubbing its antlers against the bark. But something about those marks didn't sit right with me. That night, as we sat around the campfire eating dinner, we heard distant screams echoing through the forest. Bobby froze mid-bite and looked at me with wide eyes. "What was that?" he asked. "Elk calls," I said quickly, trying to sound confident even though my stomach tightened with unease. "They make weird noises sometimes." Vivian didn't look convinced, but she didn't say anything. We finished dinner in silence and went inside the camper to sleep. The first night was colder than I expected, unnaturally cold for summer. When I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, I noticed frost forming on the windows and realized our water pipes had frozen solid. I stood there for a moment, staring at the frost-covered glass and listening to the eerie quiet outside. Something about this place felt wrong. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling trees, just silence. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Vivian was already up, making coffee on the little stove in the camper. She smiled at me, but I could tell she was worried. "The pipes are still frozen," she said softly. "I don't understand how it got so cold last night." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Mountain weather can be unpredictable," I said, though deep down I didn't believe my own words. Bobby came stumbling out of the camper a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and looking annoyed. "What's that smell?" he asked. Vivian and I exchanged a glance before stepping outside to check. That's when we saw it. Animal carcasses arranged in a perfect circle around the RV. Rabbits, squirrels, even a deer. Their bodies were mangled like something had torn them apart, but what really got me was how precise the circle was. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate. "What the hell?" Bobby muttered, pulling out his Polaroid camera to take pictures. "Don't touch anything." I warned him, my voice sharper than I intended. "Just stay close." Vivian looked pale as she clutched her jacket tighter around herself. "What could have done this?" she whispered. "Wolves, maybe." I lied, but wolves don't arrange their kills in circles. As we cleaned up the mess, because there was no way Vivian would let us leave it like that, I noticed my flask lying empty on the ground near the camper door. My stomach twisted in anger. Bobby must have found it and dumped it out as some kind of punishment for bringing it along. "Did you do this?" I snapped at him, holding up the flask. "What?" "No." He shot back, glaring at me. "I didn't even know you brought that thing." Vivian stepped between us before things could escalate further. "Enough," she said firmly. "This isn't helping." Later that day, we met another family camping nearby, the Petersons. They had 2 kids, a teenage boy named Jake and a little girl named Lily, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They seemed nice enough, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something about them being here felt wrong too, like they didn't belong in this place any more than we did. That evening, Bobby showed me some Polaroids he'd taken earlier in the day. Most of them were just trees and rocks, but one photo made my blood run cold. In the background, behind a cluster of trees, there was a blurry figure, tall and thin, with what looked like antlers on its head. "What is this?" I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," he said with a shrug. "I didn't see anything when I took it." I wanted to tell him it was probably just a trick of the light or a shadow from the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, as we sat around our campfire again, an old friend of mine showed up out of nowhere, Marcus Whitehall. He used to work with me as a ranger years ago before I lost my job. Seeing him here was both comforting and unsettling. "Didn't expect to run into you here," Marcus said with a grin as he sat down next to me by the fire. "Same," I replied cautiously. "What brings you out here?" He glanced around at the trees like he was looking for something or someone before leaning in closer to me. "You need to be careful out here," he said quietly, "so Vivian and Bobby wouldn't set here. There's something in these woods, something old." "What are you talking about?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "The locals call it the Hungry One. It's been part of their stories for generations, a spirit or creature tied to winter and starvation." He paused again and looked me straight in the eye. "If you see or hear anything strange, don't ignore it. If you see or hear anything strange, don't ignore it." Before I could ask him more, Marcus stood up and said he had to get back to his own camp before dark. His warning left me uneasy, but I didn't want to scare Vivian or Bobby by telling them about it. As we went to bed that night, the radio crackled with a weather report. An unexpected winter storm was moving into the area, a freak occurrence for July. I lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep, listening to the wind howl outside and wondering if Marcus's warning had come too late. The second night in the forest felt heavier, colder. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the camper like it was trying to get inside. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about Marcus's warning and Bobby's Polaroid photo, the blurry figure with antlers. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it became clearer. Crying. A child's crying. My heart dropped into my stomach as I sat up and listened. It sounded like Lily Peterson, the little girl we'd met earlier that day. "Harold," Vivian whispered beside me, her voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" I nodded and grabbed my flashlight. "Stay here," I told her as I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The crying was coming from the direction of the Petersons' campsite. As I walked toward it, shining my flashlight into the darkness, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence was so sharp it made my ears ring. When I reached their campsite, my stomach twisted in knots. The Petersons' tent was torn to shreds, their gear scattered everywhere. Blood stained the ground in long streaks, leading into the woods. But there was no sign of the family. No Lily, no Jake. No parents. I stood there frozen for what felt like forever before turning back toward our RV. As I walked away, I swear I heard Lily Sepp's voice again, faint and distant, "Help me." When I got back to the camper, Vivian was waiting for me at the door, her face pale with fear. "What happened?" she asked. "The zipper gone," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady for her sake. "We need to stay inside." The next morning, Bobby seemed off, quieter than usual, and pale like he hadn't slept all night. He wouldn't talk about it when Vivian asked him what was wrong. Instead, he just sat by the window staring out at the trees. Later that day, he showed me another Polaroid he'd taken. This one sent chills down my spine. It was a picture of our camper taken from outside, but in the corner of the frame, there was a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. It looked taller than any person should be, and had what appeared to be antlers on its head. "Where did you take this?" I asked him, trying to keep calm. "Last night," he said quietly without looking at me. That evening, Marcus showed up again, this time bloodied and limping like he'd been attacked by something. He collapsed onto one of our chairs by the fire and looked at me with wide eyes full of panic. "I saw it," he gasped between breaths. "It's Stepp's real." "What are you talking about?" Vivian asked as she handed him water. "The Hungry One," Marcus said weakly. "It's Sepp's not just a story. He told us about how he'd gone looking for the Petersons after hearing their daughter's cries in the night, but found only blood and claw marks leading deeper into the forest. Then he saw it. The creature from Bobby's photo standing in the snowstorm that had suddenly hit his campsite. "It steps fast," Marcus said, gripping my arm tightly as if to make sure I believed him. "And it can mimic voices," it called out to me using Lily Sepp's voice. Vivian looked at me with fear in her eyes as she held Bobby close to her side. "What do we do?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head slowly. "You can fight it, not unless you burn it." That night was worse than any night before. The temperature inside our camper dropped so low that frost formed on the walls, despite the heater running full blast. Outside, we heard voices. Lily's voice again, and then Jake's voice calling for help. Bobby started acting strange too, complaining about being hungry, even though he'd just eaten dinner minutes ago. He kept rubbing his arms like they hurt and avoided looking anyone in the eye. As we sat huddled together inside the camper, trying to stay warm and keep calm, Marcus suddenly stood up and pointed toward one of the frosted windows. "It's Sepp's here," he whispered. I turned to look where he was pointing, and there it was. The thing from Bobby's photo standing just outside our camper door. Its glowing yellow eyes stared straight at us through the glass as its breath fogged up the window. It didn't move right away. It just stood there watching us like it was deciding what to do next. By the time the sun rose, the forest felt completely different. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was dead. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of leaves rustling. The snowstorm had come overnight, blanketing everything in thick white powder in July. It didn't make sense. The roads were buried under snow, and the camper wouldn't start. Marcus tried the radio, but all it picked up was static or broken fragments of Bobby's voice, like someone was playing a sick joke on us. "We stuck," Marcus said flatly, his face grim. "There's stuck's no way out." Vivian tried to stay calm for Bobby's sake, but I could see the panic creeping into her eyes. She kept glancing at him like she was worried about something more than just the storm. Bobby wasn't himself anymore. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and he kept complaining about how hungry he was. At first, Vivian thought he might be sick, but when she caught him gnawing on raw meat from the cooler, her face turned white with fear. "Harold," she whispered to me later when Bobby wasn't set around. "Something's wrong with him." I nodded, but didn't know what to say. I'd seen it too, the way he avoided heat like it hurt him, the way his eyes seemed darker than before. It was like something inside him was changing. Marcus wasn't doing much better. He's been quiet all morning, staring out the frosted windows like he was waiting for something to happen. When I asked him what was on his mind, he shook his head and muttered something about the hunger spreading. That afternoon, Vivian found an old glove compartment in Uncle Roy Sepp's camper filled with newspaper clippings from decades ago. One headline caught her attention. "Cannibal Killings of 1932, Shoshone National Forest." She showed it to me with shaking hands. "Harold, your uncle knew about this." The article described a series of gruesome murders in the same forest we were camping in. People found half-eaten and frozen solid during a freak summer snowstorm. Witnesses reported hearing voices calling for help before disappearing into the woods. I thought back to Uncle Roy's strange behavior when he lent us the camper, how he'd insisted we take it instead of our own car, and how he'd avoided answering any questions about why it was so important to him. "He knew," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, we barricaded ourselves inside the camper as best we could, locking every door and window and piling furniture against them for good measure. The frost on the walls had spread so much that it looked like ice was growing inside the camper itself. As darkness fell, we heard voices again. Lily's voice crying for help outside, then Jake's voice calling for his parents. Vivian clutched Bobby tightly, while Marcus grabbed a knife and stood by the door like he was ready to fight whatever came through it. But nothing came through, not yet. Instead, we heard scratching sounds on the roof above us, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there wanted us to know it was close. Bobby started muttering under his breath again, something about the hungry one talking to him in his dreams. When Vivian asked him what he meant, He just shook his head and said it promised to make him feel better. I didn't know what scared me more, the creature outside or what was happening to my son inside. The fourth night felt like the forest itself was closing in on us. The cold was unbearable, even inside the camper. The heater was running full blast, but it didn't help. Frost crept along the walls and ice formed on the windows. It was like the camper had become part of the frozen landscape outside. Marcus sat by the door with his knife in hand, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't said much all day, but now he seemed focused, like he was waiting for something. Vivian stayed close to Bobby, who was curled up in a blanket, shivering despite the heat. His skin looked worse, gray and thin, like he hadn't eaten in days. But he had eaten. He'd eaten more than any of us. I tried to keep myself busy, marking protective symbols on the walls of the camper with charcoal. They were symbols I'd learned during my ranger training. Native American signs meant to ward off evil spirits. I didn't know if they would work, but it was all I could think to do. As night fell, the voices started again. This time, they were louder and closer. Lily's voice came first, crying for her mom and dad just outside the camper door. Then Jake's voice joined in, calling for help. Vivian covered her ears and shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They were not real," Marcus said firmly, gripping his knife tighter. But it was hard not to listen. The voices sounded so real, so human. Then came a new voice, Marcus Simpson's own voice, calling from outside. "It's Sep's safe now, you can come out." Marcus froze, his eyes wide with fear. "It's trying to trick us," he whispered. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as something hit the roof of the camper. We all jumped as the sound echoed through the tiny space. The scratching started again, slow and deliberate like before, but this time it was louder. "It's here," Marcus said, standing up and moving toward the door. Before I could stop him, there was another crash. A vent on the roof broke open and something reached inside. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. Marcus screamed as long, clawed fingers grabbed him and dragged him out through the vent. "Marcus!" Vivian shouted, but his screams stopped abruptly. For a moment, everything went quiet again. Too quiet. Then we heard his voice outside. "It's Sep's okay now. You can come out." Vivian clutched Bobby tighter while I grabbed an aerosol can and a lighter to make a makeshift flamethrower. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them. The frost on the windows started to crack as ice spread across the inside of the camper walls. The temperature dropped even lower. It felt like we were sitting in a freezer. Then Bobby started muttering again under his breath. "Sit's here. Sit's hungry." I turned to look at him, and that's when I saw it. His eyes weren't normal anymore. They were glowing faintly yellow like the creature's eyes in Bobby's Polaroid photo. "Harold," Vivian whispered desperately as she held Bobby tighter. "What Sep's happening to him?" Before I could answer, there was another loud crash. The door burst open and cold air rushed inside like a tidal wave. There it stood, the thing from Bobby's photo, the Wendigo. It was taller than any man I'd ever seen, with emaciated limbs and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Its antlers stretched high above its head like twisted branches covered in frost. It didn't move right away, it just stood there watching us like we were prey. I stepped forward with my makeshift flamethrower and held it out in front of me. My hands were shaking so badly, I thought I might drop it. "Stay back," I shouted at the thing. It tilted its head slightly before stepping closer, and then it spoke in Vivian Sep's voice, "Harold, help me." Vivian gasped beside me as tears streamed down her face. I lit the flame and aimed it at the creature, but it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen before, disappearing into the shadows outside before I could hit it. The camper door slammed shut behind it, leaving us alone in silence once again, but we knew it wasn't gone for good. The morning after the attack felt like waking up in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The camper was freezing, and the frost on the walls had grown so thick it looked like ice was swallowing us whole. Outside, the snowstorm hadn't let up. The world beyond the windows was nothing but white. Vivian sat next to Bobby, wrapping him in every blanket we had. He wasn't shivering anymore, but that wasn't a good thing. His skin looked worse, pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes weren't Bobby's anymore. They were darker, sunken, and every now and then I thought I saw a faint yellow glow in them. "Harold," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to do something." I nodded, but didn't know what to say. What could we do? We were trapped, and whatever was happening to Bobby, it wasn't something I understood. It wasn't something I could fix. As I stepped outside to check the propane tanks, I froze in my tracks. Sitting on the hood of the camper was Marcus's severed head, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. His eyes were wide open, staring right at me. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Vivian looked up at me with alarm. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," I lied, my voice shaking. Just stay inside." But she knew I was lying. She always knew. Later that day, as I tried to keep myself busy by marking more protective symbols on the camper walls, Bobby spoke for the first time in hours. "It's Seps talking to me," he said quietly. Vivian and I both turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" she asked gently, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "It says it can make it stop," Bobby continued, his voice flat and distant. "The hunger, the cold, it can make it all go away." My stomach twisted into knots as I crouched down in front of him. "Bobby," I said firmly, trying to get him to look at me. "You can listen to it." He finally met my eyes, and for a moment, I didn't recognize my own son. "It steps not so bad," he whispered. "It just wants me to join it." Vivian started crying softly beside him, holding him close like she could protect him from whatever was happening. That evening, as we searched through Uncle Roy's camper for anything that might help us survive another night, Vivian found something that made my blood run cold, an old journal tucked away in a drawer. The pages were filled with notes about the Wendigo, descriptions of its appearance, its powers, and how it preyed on people by mimicking their loved ones' voices. But what really caught my attention were the entries about Uncle Roy's own encounter with it back in 1932. He survived by sheer luck, but had been haunted by what he saw for the rest of his life. The journal ended with a warning: "If you hear its voice, don't follow it." That night, as we prepared for another attack, Bobby became more restless. He kept pacing back and forth inside the camper, muttering under his breath about how hungry he was. At one point, Vivian caught him trying to eat a frozen squirrel he'd found outside earlier in the day. She pulled it away from him with tears streaming down her face. "Harold," she said desperately, as she held onto Bobby tightly. I nodded grimly and grabbed an aerosol can and lighter again. If that thing came back tonight, and I knew it would, I wasn't going down without a fight. As darkness fell once more, we heard its voice again, this time using Vivian Seps' voice. "Harold, please help me." She clutched my arm tightly as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Don't listen," she whispered. But then came another voice, Bobby Seps' voice, calling from outside. "Mom? Dad? Where are you?" Vivian broke down completely at that point, sobbing into her hands while I stood frozen in place. The Wendigo wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside our heads. The fifth night was the worst. The camper felt like it was barely holding together, and the cold had seeped into everything. The frost on the walls was so thick it looked like ice was growing inside, and the heater couldn't keep up anymore. We were freezing, but that wasn't the worst of it. Bobby wasn't Bobby anymore. He sat in the corner of the camper, wrapped in blankets, but his skin was pale gray now, almost translucent. His eyes glowed faintly yellow in the dim light, and he wouldn't stop muttering under his breath. Every word he said sent chills down my spine. "It's Seps coming," he whispered. "It's Seps hungry." Vivian tried to hold him, tried to comfort him, but he pushed her away with more strength than a boy his size should have. "Don't touch me," he growled, his voice sounding deeper than it should. I knew we were running out of time. Whatever this thing was, whatever it had done to Bobby, it was winning. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and the voices came again. Lily's voice, Jake's voice, and now Marcus's voice calling for help. They sounded so real, so desperate. But we knew better now. We didn't move. We didn't answer. Vivian sat next to me while I worked on a plan. A trap to end this nightmare once and for all. I'd rigged the propane tanks from the camper to explode if I could lure the Wendigo close enough. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. Harold. Vivian said softly, her voice trembling. What if it doesn't work? I looked at her and tried to keep my voice steady. It has to. As night fell, Bobby became violent. He lunged at Vivian when she tried to give him food, biting her arm hard enough to draw blood. She screamed and pulled away while I grabbed him and pinned him down. Bobby, I shouted as he struggled against me. Stop. But his eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, stared back at me with no recognition. It wasn't my son anymore. It was something else. Vivian cried as she wrapped her arm in a towel, blood soaking through the fabric. Harold, she whispered desperately. We can save him. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. Then came the sound we'd been dreading, the scratching on the roof again, slow and deliberate, like it wanted us to know it was there. I grabbed my makeshift flamethrower and stood by the door while Vivian held Bobby tightly in her arms. Stay here, I told her firmly. But before I could do anything, Bobby started laughing, a low, eerie laugh that didn't sound like him at all. It sets here, he said calmly. The door burst open with a loud crash and cold air rushed inside like a tidal wave. There it stood, the Wendigo, tall and emaciated with glowing yellow eyes and massive antlers covered in frost. Its decaying flesh smelled like death itself. Vivian screamed as it stepped closer, its breath fogging up the air around us. I lit the flame on my makeshift weapon and aimed it at the creature, but before I could fire, Vivian did something I'll never forget. She ran outside straight toward the Wendigo, screaming at it to follow her. Vivian, I shouted as she disappeared into the snowstorm with the creature chasing after her. I wanted to run after her. I wanted to save her, but I knew what she was doing. She was giving me time to set the trap. With shaking hands, I rigged the propane tanks as quickly as I could while Bobby sat in the corner laughing softly to himself. She's gone, he muttered under his breath. It's too late. I ignored him and finished setting up the trap before grabbing him by the arm and dragging him outside into the snowstorm. The Wendigo returned moments later, wearing Vivian Sepp's bloody coat and speaking with her voice, Harold, come here. My heart broke as I stared at it, but I didn't hesitate. I ignited the propane tanks and watched as flames engulfed the creature in a massive explosion that shook the ground beneath us. For a moment I thought it was over, but then black smoke poured out of its burning body and surrounded Bobby like a living thing. No, I shouted as Bobby collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing violently. When he opened his eyes again, they weren't yellow anymore. They were pitch black and his teeth had grown sharp like an animal's. I knew what had happened, I knew what he'd become, and I knew what I had to do. With tears streaming down my face, I held him close one last time before ending it. Before ending him. By the time the sun started to rise, the forest was silent again. The snowstorm had stopped, leaving everything blanketed in white. The air was still heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in the snow, staring at what was left of the camper. The explosion had torn it apart, leaving nothing but a smoldering wreck. The Wendigo's body was gone, burned to ash in the fire, but the black smoke that had gone into Bobby. I looked down at him lying in the snow. He wasn't moving anymore. For a moment, I thought it was over, that maybe he'd been freed from whatever curse had taken him. But then his eyes opened. They weren't Bobby's eyes anymore. They were pitch black, like staring into a void. His mouth twisted into a snarl, revealing sharp teeth that didn't belong in a human face. "Dad?" he said, his voice low and guttural. It sounded like him and yet not him. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling. "Bobby," I whispered. It's Dad." He stood up, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. His head tilted to the side as he looked at me with those empty black eyes. "It's hungry," he said softly. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept what I was seeing, but I knew what had happened. The Wendigo wasn't dead. It had passed itself into Bobby, turning him into something else, something monstrous. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for the knife Marcus had left behind. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold it. "I'm sorry," I whispered as I stepped closer to him. Bobby growled low in his throat and lunged at me with unnatural speed. I barely managed to dodge him, falling into the snow as he turned and came at me again. "Bobby," I shouted, trying to reach him through whatever was controlling him. "Fight it, please." For a moment, he hesitated, just long enough for me to see something flicker in his eyes. It was small, faint, but it was there. "My son, Dad," he whispered again, his voice trembling. I stepped scared. My heart broke all over again as I realized what he was asking me to do. "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice cracking as I raised the knife. This time, when he lunged at me, I didn't hesitate. I drove the blade into his chest with all the strength I had left. He froze for a moment, his black eyes wide with shock. Then he collapsed into my arms, his body trembling as whatever was inside him finally let go. "Thank you," he whispered softly before going still. I held him there in the snow for what felt like hours, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down my face. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the frozen forest around us. It was over. Or at least, I thought it was. I don't remember much about what happened after that. The park rangers found me wandering through the snow, clutching Bobby's jacket like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I was half frozen, barely able to speak, and covered in burns from the explosion. They said I was lucky to survive. I didn't feel lucky. They asked me what happened, where my wife and son were, but I couldn't give them an answer that made sense. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I tell them about the creature, about Bobby, about Vivian running into the storm to save us? They wouldn't believe me. No one would. They took me to a hospital in town, where they treated my injuries and tried to get me to talk. The doctors said I was in shock, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the trauma, but I knew better. I knew what I saw. The Wendigo wasn't just a story. The days turned into weeks, and eventually, they moved me to a psychiatric hospital for long-term care. They said it was for my own good, that I needed time to heal. But deep down, I knew why they kept me locked up. They didn't trust me. They thought I might hurt someone. Maybe they were right. The first time it snowed after I got there, I felt it, the hunger. It started small, just a faint ache in my stomach that wouldn't go away no matter how much I ate. Then came the cold. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and never leaves. And finally, the voices. At first, it was Bobby Sepp's voice calling out to me in the night. "Dad, help me." Then Vivian Sepp's voice joined him. "Harold, come back." Sometimes it was Marcus or Lily or Jake. But it didn't matter who it was. They all said the same thing. "It's Sepp's hungry." I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop. They were always there, always waiting. The doctors noticed the changes in me, the way my appetite grew uncontrollable, the way my teeth started to feel sharper than they should be, the way my skin looked pale and thin like Bobby's had before he changed. They didn't say anything at first, but I could see it in their eyes. They were afraid of me. One night, when the snow was falling outside my window, I found myself scratching symbols into the wall with my nails. Symbols like the ones I'd marked on the camper back in the forest. They didn't help then, but maybe they would now. The nurses asked me what they meant, but I didn't answer. How could I explain something even I didn't fully understand? Now every time winter comes, I feel it getting stronger. The hunger, the cold, the voices. It's like something inside me is waking up, something that doesn't belong here. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. As snow begins to fall outside my window again tonight, I sit here staring at the frost forming on the glass and wonder if this is how it starts, if this is how it spreads. Maybe Marcus was right all along. You can't fight it. Not really. All you can do is try not to let it win.